117 days. Let's think about how long that really is. It is almost 4 months. It is a third of a year. It is the time it takes for a season to change from winter to summer. Most survival stories last a few days, a week, maybe 2. We marvel at people who survive a weekend in the woods. But Maurice and Maralyn Bailey didn't survive a weekend. They lived a lifetime on a rubber raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They drifted 1,500 miles. They watched their bodies dissolve. They watched their clothes rot off their backs. They caught sharks with their bare hands. But before they were survivors, they were something else. They were dreamers. They were a polite, middle-class British couple who decided to do what we all fantasize about. They sold the house. They sold the car. They bought a boat. They sailed away from the tax office and the gray skies of England to find paradise. And they found it. For a while. This is the story of the dream that became a nightmare, and the love story that survived the impossible. Derby, England. Maurice and Maralyn Bailey were living the normal life. Maurice was a print officer, quiet, practical, a man who could fix things. He was reserved, perhaps a little prone to pessimism, but steady as a rock. Maralyn was a tax officer, but don't let the job title fool you. She was the spark. She was fierce, chatty, optimistic, and incredibly tough. They were in their late 20s and early 30s. They had the house, they had the garden, they had the steady income, and they were bored out of their minds. They looked at their future, 40 more years of rain, tea, and taxes, and they felt trapped. They didn't want a bigger TV. They didn't want a conservatory. They wanted the world. "Why are we doing this?" Maralyn asked one night. "Why are we working for a retirement we might not live to see?" It is a question that starts every great adventure. And unlike most people, who just buy a travel magazine and sigh, the Baileys made a plan. They decided to immigrate, not by plane, by boat. They would sail to New Zealand and start a new life. But first, they needed a ship. They didn't just buy a used tub. They wanted a fortress. They chose a 31-foot Golden Hind sloop. It was a twin-keel yacht. They named her the Auralyn, a combination of author. Maralyn's middle name was Author? No, it was a mix of their names, Maurice and Maralyn. Actually, it was just a beautiful sound. Auralyn. She was built of plywood, sheathed in fiberglass. She was sturdy, hard chine, designed for ocean crossings. They poured their savings into her. Every screw, every plank, every cleat was chosen with love. They fitted her out themselves in the boatyard. Maurice installed the engine. Maralyn sewed the curtains. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was their home. It was their entire net worth floating on the water. They sold their house in Derby. When they handed over the keys, they burned the bridge. There was no going back. If the boat failed, they were homeless. June 1972. They launched from Southampton. The English Channel was gray and choppy. Their friends stood on the dock, waving. Some were jealous. Some thought they were mad. "Be careful," they shouted. Maurice stood at the tiller. He felt the weight of responsibility. He wasn't an expert sailor. They were competent, but they weren't old salts. They were learning as they went. As the white cliffs of England faded into the mist, a feeling of euphoria washed over them. They were free. No more alarm clocks. No more bosses. No more bills. Just the wind, the sea, and each other. They had no idea that this ocean, which felt so welcoming now, would eventually try to eat them alive. The first leg of the journey was idyllic. They sailed down the coast of France. They crossed the Bay of Biscay, notorious for storms, but Auralyn handled it beautifully. She was a dry boat, comfortable. They stopped in Spain. They drank cheap wine and ate tapas. They sailed to Madeira, the floating garden. They hiked the levadas. They bought fresh fruit in the markets. Then, the big jump. The Atlantic crossing. From the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. This is the milk run. The trade winds blow you across. For 3 weeks, they didn't touch the sails. They sat in the cockpit, reading books. Maurice read history. Maralyn read novels. They cooked elaborate meals in the tiny galley. Maralyn was a fantastic cook. She made stews, curries, and even baked bread on a Primus stove. They had a cat with them at this point, a Siamese cat. It was a domestic bliss that just happened to be moving at 5 knots. They arrived in Barbados, tanned, fit, and more in love than ever. They had proven they could do it. The suburban couple had become ocean voyagers. They spent months in the Caribbean, island hopping, Grenada, Bequia, St. Lucia, crystal clear water, white sand. They met other cruisers, the tribe of sea gypsies. They shared drinks in the cockpits of other boats. They swapped charts. "Where are you heading?" people asked. "New Zealand," Maurice said confidently, "through the Panama Canal." "That's a long run," the old sailors said. "The Pacific is big." "The Auralyn can take it," Maurice replied, and she could. She was a tough little boat. But the Pacific doesn't care about the boat. It cares about luck. February 1973. They transited the Panama Canal. It is a rite of passage. The massive locks lift you up 85 feet. You sail through Gatun Lake, surrounded by jungle. You hear howler monkeys screaming from the trees. Then, the locks lower you down. The gates open. And there it is, the Pacific Ocean. It looks different from the Atlantic. It feels bigger. Because it is. It covers 1/3 of the planet's surface. Once you leave Panama heading west, there is nothing. Just thousands of miles of empty water until you hit the Galapagos. And then thousands more until the Marquesas. Maurice and Maralyn stocked up in Balboa. They bought tins of food, hundreds of them. Corned beef, peaches, peas, milk. They filled the water tanks. They checked the rigging. They said goodbye to the cat. They left it with friends, knowing the Pacific crossing was too hard for a pet. They were just 2 humans in a 31-foot wooden shell. They set sail for the Galapagos Islands, the Enchanted Isles. It is about a 900-mile run from Panama. The weather was fickle, doldrums, squalls, but they were patient. They had plenty of time. By late February, they were getting close. They were excited. They wanted to see the giant tortoises. They wanted to see the marine iguanas. They were keeping a strict watch schedule. Maurice took the night watch. Maralyn took the dawn. They were careful sailors. They kept a logbook. Date, March 3rd, 1973. Position, approximately 250 miles northeast of the Galapagos. Weather, calm, light breeze. Everything was perfect. The boat was clean. The bilge was dry. They had a nice dinner that night. They talked about what they would do in New Zealand. Maybe Maurice would build furniture. Maybe Maralyn would open a shop. They went to sleep. Maurice woke up for his watch at 4 a.m. He sat in the cockpit, looking at the stars. The Southern Cross was visible. The ocean was breathing slowly. He checked the horizon. Empty. He checked the compass. On course. He went back below to make a cup of tea. He let Maralyn sleep a little longer. It was the last moment of peace they would ever know. What Maurice didn't realize, what nobody in a small yacht realized back then, was the danger of the lane. The ocean seems infinite, but ships don't drive randomly. They follow great circle routes, invisible highways on the water. Maurice and Maralyn were crossing a major shipping lane. Whale ships, cargo ships, tankers. They were moving steel mountains that ran on autopilot, and a 31-foot yacht low in the water is invisible to a radar set for high seas, especially at dawn. especially if the watch officer on the big ship is making coffee. Maurice sipped his tea. He heard a noise, not the wind, not the waves, a hum, a vibration in the hull. He stood up. He looked out the porthole, and he saw a wall of rusty steel filling the sky. March 4th, 1973. Dawn. The sound wasn't a crash, it was a crunch, like a matchbox being stepped on by a boot. Maurice was thrown across the cabin. Maralyn was jolted awake in her bunk. The Auralyn shuddered violently, heeling over until the mast almost touched the water. Maurice scrambled up the companionway ladder. He looked out. Looming over them was a steel cliff, a ship. It was a Korean whaling vessel, the Wolra. It was massive, rusty, and moving at speed. It had plowed into the port side of the Auralyn, smashing the wood, crushing the fiberglass. Maurice screamed, "Stop! You've hit us! Stop!" He waved his arms. He saw a crewman on the stern of the ship. The crewman looked down. He saw the yacht spinning in the wake. Did he shout an alarm? Did he run to the bridge? No. He just looked. The ship didn't slow down. The propeller churned the water, pushing the crippled yacht away. The engine throbbed, fading into the distance. The Walrus sailed on, leaving 2 people to die in its wake. The silence returned instantly. But now, it was accompanied by a new sound: gurgle, rush, splash, water. Maurice jumped back down into the cabin. "Maralyn, are you hurt?" "No," she said, clutching the blankets. "What happened?" "We've been rammed. Check the bilge." Maurice pulled up the floorboards. His heart stopped. The ocean was rushing in. A massive hole in the hull just below the waterline. It wasn't a leak. It was a flood. The water was already over the batteries. The lights flickered and died. "Pumps!" Maurice shouted. He grabbed the manual bilge pump. He pumped furiously. Maralyn grabbed a bucket. They worked for 5 minutes in a frenzy, but the water level kept rising. It was up to their ankles, then their shins. The Auralyn felt heavy, sluggish. She was dying. Maurice stopped pumping. He looked at Maralyn. His face was pale. "It's no use," he said quietly. "She's going down. We have to abandon ship." Now began the most critical 20 minutes of their lives. The decisions they made in this chaos would decide if they lived or died. They had to choose what to take. Imagine your house is burning down. You have minutes. What do you grab? Now imagine your house is sinking into an abyss, and there are no shops, no hospitals, and no land for 1,000 miles. Maurice launched the life raft. It was a round, orange inflatable raft, 6-man capacity. It had a canopy. They also had a small 9-foot inflatable dinghy. They tied them together. Then, the bucket brigade began. Maralyn became a machine. She suppressed the panic. She waded through the knee-deep water in the cabin, grabbing everything she could reach: tins of food, corned beef, peaches, milk, water jugs. They only managed to grab a few. The sextant, the maps, passports, money. Useless, but instinct makes you take them. Warm clothes, cardigans, oilskins, knives, a pair of scissors, and, crucially, a bag of safety pins. Maralyn didn't know why she grabbed the safety pins. It was just a sewing kit. But those pins would become their fishing hooks. Those pins would save their lives. The water was waist-deep now. Books were floating past them. Photographs of their wedding. The cushions they had sewn. "Get out, Maralyn!" Maurice shouted. She climbed into the cockpit, then jumped into the raft. Maurice followed. He cut the painter line connecting them to the yacht. They drifted away. They sat in the orange rubber donut, shivering, wet, and shocked. They watched the Auralyn. She sat low in the water. Her mast was still standing tall. She looked brave. Then she tipped forward. The bow went down. The stern lifted. With a sigh of escaping air, she slid beneath the surface. The mast was the last thing to disappear. Then just bubbles, oil slick, a few floating cushions. Their home, their dream, their financial future, gone. It was 10 a.m. They were alone. They took stock of their new world. They had two vessels. The raft. This was the house. It had a tent-like canopy to protect them from the sun and rain. It was about 6 feet across, round. Squeeze two adults in there, and you can't stretch your legs. The dinghy. This was the trailer. They tied it to the raft with a rope. It was open to the sky. They used it for storage and later for exercise. The raft was soft. The floor was just a sheet of rubber separating them from the deep ocean. Every time a wave went under them, the floor rippled. It felt like sitting on a waterbed on top of a roller coaster. Maralyn looked at Maurice. He was devastated. Maurice was a man who defined himself by his ability to provide and protect. He had built the boat. He was the captain. Now, he was a castaway. He put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Maralyn," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Maralyn reached out and took his hand. "We are alive, Maurice," she said firmly. "We are together. We will make it." She took charge of the morale from Minute One. They arranged the supplies. They counted every calorie. It wasn't much. 30 tins of food, peanuts, spam, condensed milk, vegetables, a few packets of biscuits, a bag of sugar, a jar of glucose sweets, 9 gallons of water. That sounds like a lot, but do the math. 2 people. A standard human needs 2 liters of water a day. 9 gallons is about 34 liters. That is 8 days of water at normal consumption, or 20 days at starvation rations. And they were drifting. Maurice looked at the chart he had saved. They were in the Humboldt Current. The current flows west and north, toward the Galapagos. "We are about 250 miles from the islands," Maurice calculated. "At 1 knot drift speed, we could be there in 10 to 15 days. It seemed manageable. "We just have to hold out for 2 weeks, Maurice said. They didn't know that the current wouldn't take them to the Galapagos. It would take them around the Galapagos, and then push them into the empty expanse of the Central Pacific. Night fell on day 1. The ocean changed. During the day, the Pacific is blue and relatively friendly. At night, it is black and noisy. The waves hissed. The wind whistled through the canopy. And then, the bumping started. Thump, thump. Sharks. They were attracted by the smell of the sinking yacht and the new floating object. They rubbed their sandpaper skin against the bottom of the raft. Maurice and Maralyn froze. They were sitting on a millimeter of rubber. If a shark bit the floor, they would sink. They held each other in the pitch black. They were soaking wet. The sea spray was constant. They were cold. They realized that the tropical ocean is freezing at night when you are wet. They huddled under the damp blankets. Maralyn started a diary in a notebook she had saved. She wrote with a pencil. Day 1. Auralyn gone. We are safe in the raft. Maurice is sad. I must keep him busy. The first week was a waiting game. They expected to be rescued. They were in a shipping lane. They had seen the Woolra. There must be other ships. They established a routine. Watch keeping. Scan the horizon. Look for smoke. Look for masts. They saw a ship on day 3. It was a tanker, miles away. They lit a flare. The red fire sputtered and hissed. They waved. Over here, over here. The tanker didn't turn. It kept going. They watched it disappear over the curve of the earth. The disappointment was physically painful. It felt like a punch to the gut. Maurice slumped. They can't see us, he said. We are too low. The raft was a tiny orange dot in a world of whitecaps. Maralyn refused to despair. "The next one will see us," she said. She started rationing the food. 2 biscuits a day, a sip of water. She made drawings in her diary. She drew plans for their next boat. "When we get back," she told Maurice, "we will build another one." She spoke in the future tense. Never if, always when. Day 7. The food was dwindling faster than they hoped, but nature began to arrive. First, the turtles. Sea turtles are curious. They came to the raft to investigate the shadow. They floated alongside, looking at the humans with ancient eyes. Maurice looked at the turtle. He looked at the knife. He had never killed a large animal in his life. He was a gentle man, but he was hungry. "We have to catch one," Maurice said. He leaned over the side. He grabbed the turtle by the shell. It was heavy, thrashing. He hauled it into the raft. The turtle snapped its beak. Its flippers slapped the rubber. Maurice had to kill it. It was gruesome. It was messy. Blood filled the raft. But it was meat. They drank the blood. Turtle blood is not salty. It hydrates you. They ate the raw meat. It tasted like veal. They realized they had entered a new food chain. They were no longer observers of nature. They were participants. And this attracted more attention. The blood in the water brought the sharks closer, and it brought the birds. Boobies and frigate birds landed on the dinghy. They looked at the humans as if they were statues. Maralyn looked at the bird. "Hello?" she whispered. Then she grabbed it by the neck. Day 20. The map said they should be there. According to Maurice's calculations, the Galapagos Islands were just over the horizon. They strained their eyes. They looked for the telltale clouds that gather over land. They saw nothing. The ocean currents are cruel. The Humboldt Current doesn't flow into the islands like a conveyor belt. It splits. It wraps around them. Maurice and Maralyn were in the stream that bypassed the archipelago to the north. They were drifting past salvation. They didn't know it yet, but this was the tipping point. If they hit the islands, the ordeal was over. If they missed them, there was nothing ahead for 3,000 miles, just the empty, deep Central Pacific. When Maurice realized they had passed the longitude of the islands, he fell silent. The tinned food was almost gone. The water was low. The 2-week adventure was over. Now, the siege began. Day 25. Starvation changes the way you think. Civilized thoughts about mortgages, politics, or manners evaporate. Your brain becomes a singular engine focused on one word: protein. They needed fish. The raft had become a floating reef. Barnacles had started to grow on the bottom. Small fish gathered in the shadow of the rubber. Larger fish, triggerfish, dorado, circled the small fish. It was a buffet right under their feet, but they had no hooks. Maralyn remembered the sewing kit. She pulled out the safety pins. Maurice looked at them. They were flimsy. But Maurice was an engineer at heart. He took a pair of pliers. He bent the safety pin. He fashioned a barb. He tied it to a piece of string. He needed bait. They used a piece of turtle meat. He dropped the line. The water exploded. A triggerfish grabbed the pin. Maurice hauled it in. The fish flopped on the rubber floor. It was rough, ugly, and beautiful. They didn't cook it. They couldn't. They cut it open. They ate the fillets raw. It was sweet. It was firm. Maralyn chewed slowly. "It's better than steak," she said. The safety pin was the most valuable tool on the planet. The turtles became their lifeline. Catching them was a wrestling match. Killing them was a butchery. But they learned the anatomy of survival. The blood of the turtle was crucial. They couldn't drink seawater. It kills you. But turtle blood has a salinity level that humans can tolerate in small amounts. They would catch a turtle, turn it over, and slit the throat. They caught the blood in a cup. They drank it like wine. It was warm. It coated the throat. Then, the fat. Green turtle fat is rich and yellow. They melted it in the sun to make oil. They rubbed the oil on their skin to stop the salt sores. They dipped the dry fish meat in the oil to make it swallowable. They became experts. They knew which part of the turtle tasted like chicken, which part like beef. They even ate the contents of the turtle's stomach, partially digested seaweed. It was their only source of vitamin C. It prevented scurvy. They were becoming part of the ocean's food chain. But where there is blood, there are sharks. The sharks were relentless. They weren't just circling, they were aggressive. They would ram the bottom of the raft, trying to knock the humans into the water. One day, a large mako shark attacked the dinghy. It bit the inflation tube. Pop! The air rushed out. The dinghy started to sag. Maurice panicked. The dinghy was their storage shed. It was their buffer. If they lost the dinghy, they lost their reserve buoyancy. Maurice grabbed the paddle. He hit the shark. Maralyn grabbed a tin can and banged it on the side. The shark let go, but the damage was done. The dinghy was limping. They had to patch it. Have you ever tried to patch a wet, inflatable boat in the middle of the ocean while sharks are circling? It took hours. They used the glue from the repair kit. They held the patch down with their hands until their muscles cramped. From that day on, the sharks were the enemy. Maurice made a spear from a paddle and a knife. When a shark came too close, he stabbed it. The violence was primal. The gentle printer from Derby had become a warrior protecting his cave. Day 50. The body begins to consume itself. First, the fat goes. Maurice and Maralyn were lean to begin with. Now, the muscle began to atrophy. Their arms became sticks. Their ribs protruded like the hull of a starving ship. But the worst part was the salt. Salt water boils. Because they were constantly wet, their skin began to rot. Boils appeared on their legs and backs. The boils would burst, leaving open, weeping sores. Then the salt water would wash into the sores. The pain was excruciating. It was like being burned with cigarettes. They couldn't lie down comfortably. They couldn't sit. Maralyn's knees were raw bone. Their clothes were rotting off their bodies. The cotton shirts disintegrated. The elastic in their underwear failed. They were nearly naked, covered in ulcers, smelling of fish guts and unwashed bodies. They looked like monsters. But they looked at each other with tenderness. Maralyn would dress Maurice's sores with turtle oil. "You're doing well, love," she would whisper. "You're doing so well." Maurice struggled with depression. He felt the weight of the failure. He had steered them into this. He would spend days staring at the floor of the raft, refusing to move. "What's the point?" he would ask. "Nobody is coming." This is where Maralyn saved them. She refused to let him sink. She invented games. "Let's design the next boat," she said. "I don't want a next boat," Maurice grumbled. "Yes, you do. This one will have a steel hull and watertight bulkheads." She forced him to draw plans on the back of labels. She made him play dominoes with pieces she made from paper. She made him talk. "Tell me about your childhood, Maurice. Tell me everything." She knew that silence was death. If they stopped talking, they would retreat into their own minds, and they would never come back. She was the battery that kept the raft powered. It wasn't always calm. The Pacific storms are terrifying. The waves can reach 20 or 30 feet. The raft was a cork. When a storm hit, they had to close the canopy. It became a dark, tumbling washing machine. The noise was deafening. The wind howled like a jet engine. The raft would climb a wave, teeter on the crest, and then crash down into the trough. They had to hold on to the lifelines until their hands bled. If the raft capsized, they were dead. They would be trapped under the canopy, disoriented, and drown. During one storm, the raft tipped almost vertical. Maurice and Maralyn were thrown into a heap. Water poured in. They had to bail. Bailing is the most exhausting work on Earth. Scoop, throw, scoop, throw, for hours, while seasick, while starving. When the storm passed, they would collapse, shivering, into the wet puddle that was their bed. The cruelest torture was the ships. They saw 7 ships during their drift. 7 times, hope flared up. 7 times, they lit flares. 7 times, they waved their orange shirts. And 7 times, the ships kept going. One container ship passed so close they could see the crew walking on the deck. They screamed, "We are here! Look down!" The crew didn't look down. They were looking at the horizon, or at their phones, or at nothing. The ship passed. The wake rocked the raft. The smell of diesel exhaust lingered in the air, the smell of civilization. And then it was gone. After the 7th ship, Maurice broke. He wept uncontrollably. "They don't care," he sobbed. "We are invisible." Maralyn held him. "We don't need them," she lied. "We can drift to China if we have to." By day 80, the raft was no longer a foreign object. It was a biological entity. Seaweed grew on the bottom. Crabs lived in the folds of the rubber. A school of triggerfish followed them everywhere. They were pets. Maralyn named them. There was Fred, a small fish that lived under the dinghy. They stopped eating Fred. He was company. Birds would land on the canopy to rest. Sometimes Maralyn would catch a bird for food, but sometimes she just let them sit there. It was strange. They were dying, yet they were more connected to the life of the planet than they had ever been in Derby. They knew the phases of the moon. They knew the constellations. They knew the mood of the ocean by the color of the water. They were shedding their humanity and becoming sea creatures. But the sea creatures were wearing out. The raft was deteriorating. The glue was peeling. The rubber was chafing. The dinghy was leaking air constantly. They were racing against the disintegration of their vessel, and they were losing. Day 90. The dinghy was dying. The small inflatable boat they towed behind the main raft, their trailer, their storage shed, their exercise yard, was rotting. The tubes were porous. It required pumping every hour just to stay afloat. It was becoming a liability. It dragged in the water, slowing their drift. It attracted sharks. And Maurice didn't have the strength to pump it anymore. They made the decision. It felt like an amputation. They transferred the last few items into the main raft, a few rusty tins, the water jugs. Then Maurice took his knife. He cut the tow rope. The dinghy drifted away slowly. It looked pathetic, deflated, sagging. Maralyn watched it go. She felt a surge of panic. That dinghy was their backup. If the main raft popped, they could have retreated to it. Now, there was no backup. They were living in a 6-foot rubber circle. If this circle failed, they swam. And if they swam, they died. The ocean felt suddenly twice as big. With the dinghy gone, the main raft became a prison cell, and the prison was crumbling. The Avon raft was designed to last for 2 weeks, maybe 3. It had been in the salt water under the equatorial sun for 3 months. The glue was dissolving. The seams were peeling apart. Maurice spent his days with the repair kit, frantically patching leaks. But the worst part was the floor. The rubber floor was chafing away. It was becoming thin, translucent. They could feel the shapes of the fish swimming underneath their buttocks. They were terrified to move. If they shifted their weight too fast, a knee or an elbow might punch right through the bottom. They sat frozen, statues in a disintegrating temple. And because the floor was leaking, they were sitting in water. Always. The salt water sores on their legs turned into ulcers, deep, crater-like holes that ate into the flesh. The pain was constant, a dull, throbbing toothache in their entire bodies. Day 100. The hunger pangs stopped. This is a physiological shift. The body stops screaming for food and starts shutting down systems to preserve the brain. They entered the starvation coma. They weren't awake. They weren't asleep. They existed in a twilight state. They would close their eyes and dream vividly. They dreamed of food, not just eating, but cooking. Maurice dreamed he was fixing a car engine made of chocolate. Maralyn dreamed she was pushing a shopping cart through a supermarket, but the aisles went on forever and she couldn't reach the shelves. They would wake up and talk about the dreams as if they were real. "I had roast beef," Maurice would mumble. "Was it good?" Maralyn would ask. "A bit dry, needed gravy." They were losing their grip on reality. Sometimes, they didn't know if they were on a raft or in their bed in Derby. Then a wave would splash them, and the cold reality would rush back in. Day 106. A sound woke them, a blast of air. Whoosh! Like a steam train. They opened their eyes. Looming over the raft was a mountain of gray flesh, a sperm whale. It was 50 feet long, massive, ancient. It was floating right next to them. Its eye, the size of a dinner plate, was looking at them. It could have destroyed them with a twitch of its tail. It could have swallowed the raft whole. Maurice froze. He held Maralyn's hand so tight his knuckles turned white. The whale didn't attack. It slipped under the raft. They felt the massive body lift them up. The rubber floor bulged. They were riding on the back of a leviathan. It was terrifying, yet strangely gentle. The whale surfaced on the other side. It blew its spout again. Whoosh! A mist of fishy water covered them. Then it sounded. The tail rose high in the air, water cascading off the flukes, and it dove. They sat in the silence, rocking in its wake. They felt incredibly small. "He knew," Maralyn whispered. "He knew we were helpless." Day 110. They accepted the end. They weren't fishing anymore. They didn't have the strength to pull the line. They weren't catching turtles. They couldn't lift them. They were just drifting, waiting for the organs to fail. They decided to write their goodbyes. They had notebooks. Maurice wrote to his mother, "Dear Mom, we tried. We really tried. Don't be sad. We were together." Maralyn wrote to her family. She tried to keep it cheerful, but her handwriting was shaky. "We have had a grand adventure, but the sea is too big." They put the letters in a plastic bag. They hoped that if they died, the raft would eventually wash up somewhere, maybe in a year, maybe in 10 years. They wanted people to know they didn't panic. They wanted people to know they loved each other to the end. Day 115. The Pacific decided to throw one last punch. A squall hit them. It wasn't a hurricane, but in their condition, a breeze felt like a gale. The waves picked up. The raft tossed violently. Maurice was thrown against the side. His bones were so brittle, he thought his ribs would snap. The canopy tore. Rain poured in. They were lying in 6 inches of water, shivering uncontrollably. Hypothermia set in. Their teeth chattered so hard they thought they would break. I can't hold on," Maurice stammered. He stopped shivering. That is the danger sign. When you stop shivering, you're dying. Maralyn dragged herself over to him. She wrapped her arms around him. She used her body heat, what little she had left, to warm him. "Stay with me, Maurice," she commanded. "Don't you dare leave me." They lay tangled together in the wet, dark misery. They survived the night, but they knew they couldn't survive another one. June 30th, 1973. Dawn broke. The sky was gray. The sea was gray. They were alive, but barely. They were skeletons covered in skin that looked like parchment. Their eyes were sunken deep into their skulls. They couldn't stand up. They couldn't crawl. They lay on their backs, staring at the torn orange canopy. They had no water left. They had 2 tins of food left, but they couldn't open them because their hands were too weak to work the opener. This was it, the end of the line. Maurice closed his eyes. "It's peaceful," he whispered. Maralyn looked at him. She wanted to shake him, but she couldn't lift her arms. She closed her eyes too. They drifted. Silence. Just the slap of the water against the rotting rubber. Slap, slap, slap. And then, a new sound. Not the wind, not the water. A hum, a deep, rhythmic thrumming. It was getting louder. Maralyn opened her eyes. Was she dreaming? She forced herself to sit up. It took every ounce of willpower. She looked through the tear in the canopy. About a mile away, a ship, a fishing boat. And it wasn't passing. It was coming toward them. June 30th, 1973. Maralyn stared at the ship. It was a small white fishing boat. It was about a mile away. Her brain told her it was a hallucination. She had seen phantom ships before. She blinked. She rubbed her eyes with her skeletal knuckles. It was still there, and it was changing shape. It was getting wider. That meant it was turning toward them. Adrenaline, a chemical they hadn't felt in weeks, flooded her system. She grabbed Maurice's shoulder. "Maurice," she croaked. "A ship, a ship." Maurice didn't open his eyes. "No," he mumbled. "Let me sleep." He thought she was dreaming again. He thought she was talking about the chocolate car or the supermarket. "Wake up!" She hit him. He opened one eye. He sat up, groaning in pain. He looked. His jaw dropped. The apathy vanished. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God." They had to signal. They had no flares left. They had used the last one weeks ago on a ship that didn't see them. They tried to shout, "Help! Over here!" Their voices were whispers. The wind swallowed the sound instantly. They tried to stand up to wave. They couldn't. Their legs had atrophied. They were useless sticks. They fell back down onto the wet rubber. Panic set in. If the ship didn't see movement, it might think the raft was debris. It might turn away. Maurice grabbed Maralyn's orange oilskin jacket. He tied it to a paddle. He lifted it. His arms were shaking violently. The paddle felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He waved it back and forth. "Please," he begged, "please look this way." The ship kept coming. Then it stopped. It sat there in the water, rocking. Maybe they were checking their nets. Maybe they didn't see the raft. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The Baileys sat in the raft, holding their breath, tears streaming down their salt-crusted faces. Then the ship's bow turned. It pointed straight at them. 3 blasts of the horn. Honk, honk, honk. It was the most beautiful sound in the history of the world. The ship was the Waolmi 306, often referred to as the Suhaili in reports, but it was a Korean tuna fisher. It slowed down as it approached the orange blob. The captain, Soo Chung-il, looked through his binoculars. He expected to see a lost fishing buoy. Instead, he saw 2 skeletons waving an orange coat. He shouted orders. The crew ran to the rail. They looked down. The sight silenced them. They saw a rotting rubber raft covered in barnacles and seaweed, and inside, 2 creatures that barely looked human. Maurice and Maralyn were naked except for rags. Their skin was black from the sun. Their hair was matted and bleached white. Their bodies were emaciated, ribs, hips, and knees protruding sharply. They were covered in open, weeping ulcers. The sailors gasped. Some crossed themselves. The ship pulled alongside. A sailor threw a rope. Maurice tried to grab it, but his fingers wouldn't close. He fumbled it. The sailor threw it again. This time, Maurice caught it. He tied it to the raft. "Come up!" the sailors shouted in broken English. "Climb!" They threw a rope ladder. Maurice looked at the ladder. He looked at his legs. "We can't," he whispered. He pointed to his legs. The sailors understood. 2 crewmen jumped into the water. They swam to the raft. They didn't recoil from the smell. they were gentle. They lifted Maurice first. He weighed nothing, less than 90 pounds. They passed him up to the hands waiting on the deck. Then they lifted Maralyn. She was clutching her notebook, her diary. "Don't lose it," she whispered. They hauled her up. As soon as her feet touched the steel deck, she collapsed, her legs folded like wet cardboard. They lay on the deck of the Wyoming. The sensation was overwhelming. It was hard, solid. It didn't move. It didn't squish. The engine vibration hummed through their spines. They looked up. A circle of Korean faces looked down at them. The faces were filled with pity and shock. The captain pushed through the crowd. He knelt down. He touched Maurice's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Maurice looked at him. He tried to speak, but he just started crying. He grabbed the captain's hand and kissed it. Maralyn looked at the sky. It was the same sky she had looked at for 117 days. But now, it wasn't an enemy. The crew carried them inside. They didn't put them in the sick bay. It was a small boat. They put them in the captain's cabin. They gave up their own bunks. They stripped off the rotting rags. They washed the salt and the fish guts off their bodies with warm water and sponges. They applied ointment to the ulcers. The pain was intense, but it was a healing pain. They dressed them in clean, oversized t-shirts. Maurice looked at his arm. It was clean. It was dry. He couldn't believe it. The dryness was a luxury he had forgotten existed. Then came the food. They were starving, but you can't feed a starving person a steak. It will kill them. The cook understood this. He brought a bowl of warm milk and rice water. He held the spoon to Maralyn's lips. She opened her mouth. The warm liquid hit her tongue. The flavor exploded in her brain. Sweet, creamy, safe. She swallowed. Her stomach cramped instantly. It wasn't used to working. She groaned. "Slowly," the captain said. "Slowly." They took an hour to drink a cup of milk. It was the best meal of their lives. Better than the lobster in the Caribbean. Better than the tapas in Spain. It was life. That night they slept in a bed. A dry bed with sheets. But they couldn't sleep. The silence was too loud. They missed the sound of the waves slapping the rubber. They missed the wind. Maurice reached out in the dark. "Maralyn?" "I'm here, Maurice." "Is the raft gone?" "Yes, it's gone." The crew had tried to hoist the raft aboard as a souvenir, but it fell apart. It disintegrated as they lifted it. It had held together exactly long enough. Not a day less, not a day more. The Auralyn had carried them thousands of miles. The raft had carried them 1,500 miles. Now, the Wyoming was taking them to Hawaii. They were safe, but they were broken. Their bodies were wrecked, their minds were fragile, and they were penniless. They had lost everything: boat, money, clothes, except each other. July 1973, Honolulu, Hawaii. The Wyoming 306 docked. The gangplank was lowered. Ambulances were waiting. Cameras were flashing. Maurice and Maralyn were carried off on stretchers. They looked like visitors from a concentration camp. Maralyn weighed 80 pounds. Maurice weighed 90. They were taken to the hospital. The doctors were amazed they were alive. Their blood work was chaotic. Their muscles had wasted away so much that they couldn't even lift a spoon. But their stomachs, thanks to the gentle care of the Korean cook, were working. The recovery was painful. As the nerves in their legs started to regenerate, the pain was blinding. Like firewalking, Maurice called it. They had to relearn everything: how to walk, how to hold a pen, how to sleep in a room with a door that closed. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the noise. Honolulu is a loud city. Traffic, sirens, televisions. After 117 days of only wind and water, the noise of civilization felt like a physical assault. They would lie in their hospital beds, holding hands, wishing for the silence of the raft. The story broke worldwide. Couple survives 4 months on raft. It was the survival story of the decade. Reporters flew in from London, New York, Tokyo. They crowded into the hospital room. They asked the usual questions. What did you eat? Did you think you were going to die? How did you go to the bathroom? Maurice and Maralyn answered politely. They were British after all, but they felt a strange disconnect. The reporters treated the ocean as a monster. The cruel sea, they called it. But Maralyn didn't see it that way. The sea wasn't cruel, she told a confused reporter. It was indifferent. It fed us. It watered us. It let us live. We are not victims. We are students. This perspective confused people. They wanted a horror story. The Baileys gave them a love story about nature. Then came the big question. A reporter from the BBC asked it. Well, I suppose that's it for sailing, isn't it? You'll be moving back to Derby? Maurice looked at Maralyn. They didn't have a penny. Their boat was at the bottom of the Pacific. They had no home. But the idea of going back to the tax office, back to the 9-to-5? That was more terrifying than the sharks. Maurice cleared his throat. No, he said. The room went quiet. We are going back, Maurice said. Back where? To the sea. The reporters laughed. They thought he was joking. He wasn't. We made a mistake, Maurice said. We trusted the shipping lane. Next time, we will be smarter. But we are not quitting. They returned to England, but only to work. They sat down and wrote a book, 117 Days Adrift. They poured their diaries into it. Every turtle, every storm, every moment of despair. It became a bestseller. And what did they do with the money? Did they buy a cottage in the Cotswolds? No. They went to a boatyard. They commissioned a new yacht, Auralyn II. But this one was different. It was built of steel, not wood. It had 5 watertight bulkheads. You could saw it in half, and it would still float. It was a tank. They designed it specifically to survive a collision with a whale or a ship. Their friends told them they were insane. You have PTSD. You should be in therapy. This is our therapy, Maralyn said. Building the new boat was the only way to exorcise the ghost of the old one. 2 years after the rescue, they launched Auralyn II. They sailed out of the harbor. Imagine the fear. The first time they saw a wave. The first time the sun went down. Maurice stood at the helm, his hands gripping the wheel. He was shaking, but he stayed. They didn't just sail around the bay. They sailed to Patagonia. They sailed to the wildest, most dangerous waters on Earth. Why? Because they had changed. They couldn't relate to civilized people anymore. They couldn't talk about football or fashion. They only felt at home in the wild. They spent years sailing the Antarctic waters. They became researchers. They studied the very things that had terrified them. They studied whales. They studied sharks. They realized that on the raft they had been part of the ecosystem. They missed that connection. They spent the next decade living as sea gypsies, free and uncatchable. Eventually, age caught up with them. They had to swallow the anchor. They moved to a small cottage in Lymington, England. It was filled with charts, sextants, and photos of the Auralyn II. They were eccentrics. The neighbors knew them as the quiet couple who kept to themselves. Maralyn died in 2002. Maurice was devastated. He had lost his captain. He lived on for another 16 years, alone in the cottage. He was a lonely man. He missed her, and he missed the sea. He died in 2018. But they left a legacy. What did 117 days achieve? It changed survival gear forever. Because of their book, life raft manufacturers changed their designs. They added better solar stills for making water. They added better fishing kits, based on Maralyn's safety pins. they added patching kits that actually worked underwater. Thousands of sailors are safer today because Maurice and Maralyn suffered. But the real legacy is psychological. They proved that the human mind is the strongest survival tool. They didn't survive because they were Navy SEALs. They survived because they were a married couple who refused to let the other one die. They proved that love, practical, bickering, supportive love, is waterproof. Most people think a survival story ends when the helicopter arrives, but for Maurice and Maralyn Bailey, the rescue was just an interruption. They didn't survive the ocean to escape it. They survived it to return to it. In their minds, the disaster wasn't the sinking of the yacht. The disaster would have been giving up. They spent 117 days drifting, stripped of everything that society says matters: money, status, clothes. And when they were naked under the stars, they found something indestructible. They found themselves. And once you find that, you can never go back to being ordinary.